because they are so emotionally blocked that their behavior, their maladaptive beliefs, behaviors, and patterns tends to be so destructive that that destruction typically falls on you. Because a lot of times they tend to set up situations. Remember, they've enlisted people that are not going to challenge that narcissistic way of life or perception. Instead, what they do is they have these people, and these people will cater to the narcissist. Now, we don't want to confuse it and say, well, then it's those people's fault. But we don't want to do that because blame and shame gets us nowhere. So in this video, we're going to talk about narcissistic twisted empathy. And we're going to focus on how narcissistic individuals use empathy as a way not only to perhaps ingratiate themselves to you, but also how they use it as a manipulation tactic or tool in order to pull you in closer. And then you can end up really surprised what you've gotten yourself into. So let's talk about it. Let's uncover it. And let's get going. So first off, I just want to just cover real brief, what is narcissistic personality disorder? So narcissistic personality disorder, typically it's an individual that is highly focused on themselves, and their goal is to keep themselves protected. Now, they utilize a protective strategy, and that protective strategy is that I'm great, everybody else is broken and wrong, and because I'm great, no one can hurt me because I know everything. And the reality is that underneath that, what we find is guilt, shame, doubt, inferiority. And this tends to really disrupt their relationships, and it really impacts how they see themselves, because what happens is it's such a distorted view, and that's pretty common with all individuals across the narcissistic spectrum, that they have impaired insight. And you would think, so let's say, for example, that I'm going to go up to my boss and I'm going to call my boss an idiot. And I'm going to tell my boss that he's so incompetent that he doesn't know what he's doing. And just to throw in a twister, I'm going to say that, and your wife is gross. Now, in the narcissistic's mind, of course, it depends upon the severity of the narcissism, and not all narcissists are the same. And we can do a video on that if you'd like. Just put a comment in there, and I'm happy to do that. But what happens is that that'd be pretty extreme. And the reality is that because of that impaired insight, the narcissistic individual doesn't really understand that what they're doing is putting their job at risk, their livelihood at risk, because what they're thinking is, well, I'm going to tell him the truth, and he is going to be like, oh my God, Bill is so right. Bill knows everything, and I really should have listened to Bill the whole time. That's actually what they think. In many cases, when I'm working with an individual along the narcissistic spectrum, that they're often, I wouldn't say surprised, but they have trouble understanding the consequences of their behaviors. Now, verbiage is a behavior as well, things that they say and things that they do. And when we talk about empathy, a lot of narcissists are really good at reading people. Now, it depends upon social proficiency. Some are better than others, right? We don't want to make any grand statements. But, so if they have a decent degree of social proficiency, what you find is that they're able to identify those emotions in others and use those emotions in order to get that person closer, because they utilize a tactic called enlistment. And enlistment is that I might be really empathetic with you about an issue that you're having, or seem that way, but it's very surface. You ever talk to somebody and they're kind of telling you about their day, and you're kind of like, oh, okay, this is my calendar, this is what I have going on, and there's not a lot of emotion wrapped up in it. But they're not talking about their calendar, they're talking about your emotions and how you feel. Now, if you are emotionally deprived, then what happens is that anyone talking about your emotion, whether it's sincere, feels fake, feels shallow, whatever, you may miss it because someone's finally listening to you and your behavior and what you're going through and your feelings. And that you can feel really connected. So you start getting enlisted into that individual's world. Next thing you know, you're fully in there, right? You're hanging out with them and all of that, and that empathy that you thought they had suddenly washes away, right? The tide came in, well, the tide's going out, and the tide goes back out, and along with it goes that empathy. So then what happens is that empathy, now they still have that social proficiency. They can still identify those emotions in you, but now they use it as a control tactic. And using emotional identification as a control tactic, what you see here is that you start to recognize that, oh, so this person is sad. Okay, so then, but I also know, and this isn't conscious, this is very unconscious. That's important as well. We'll get to that in just a second. But, so they recognize this person is sad. And they also know that this person perhaps has a tendency to feel bad about themselves, be hypercritical of themselves, so on and so forth. So what happens is that the narcissist, in order to manipulate you, taps into that feeling of sadness, so you feel a little hurt, but they attach it to that sense of low self-esteem. So, Sally, I'm sorry, or actually wouldn't say I'm sorry. I'm going to take that back. What they would say is, Sally, you're sad. I get it, but you're going to have to get yourself together. You're going to have to get yourself together and quit feeling that way. Get over it and get up and do A, B, and C for me, because that is going to help you feel better. And they don't say it quite that directly, right? They say it indirectly, so that now you feel guilty for being sad, and you connected it to a particular behavior so that you feel like this new guilt that's come up can now dissipate if you engage in that behavior. Sound familiar? It just might. And this is a really common tactic, and it is very corrosive to relationships, family relationships, work relationships, friendships, romantic relationships, marriages. It eats it away because empathy as a manipulative tactic erodes relationships. It makes things more complicated, more difficult. And I know you know what I mean, otherwise you probably wouldn't be watching this video. Like, you get it. So we have to look for it. We got to look at those two parts of empathy, right? We have a cognitive component, we have an affective component. Now, the cognitive component is that it's how you think influences how you feel. The affective component is the actual feelings that the person experiences. Now, even though individuals with NPD or with a high degree of narcissism, that they may not have good insight for themselves, but they're good at identifying people depending on that social proficiency. So we want to be aware that some are good, some are bad, but it's that ability to connect how you feel to what you're thinking and then engage in behaviors that helps the narcissist feel empowered. This is why narcissistic parents are particularly problematic. And that is because they use these tactics on their kids so that they feel better. And it genuinely is a lack of insight. And I know that's probably really hard for a lot of people to hear because it feels so purposeful. It's like, how could they not know? How could you not know that A plus B, you're going to hit C eventually? Believe it or not, a lot of them have trouble putting that simple formula in place. And they really do. And I'm not saying that it's a good thing. I'm not saying that it's a bad thing. I'm just saying that that's what it is. That's been my experience. So we have to look at the cognitive process and how they're dealing with these things. And often, because they are so emotionally blocked, that their behavior, their maladaptive beliefs, behaviors, and patterns tends to be so destructive that that destruction typically falls on you. Because a lot of times they tend to set up situations. Remember, they've enlisted people that are not going to challenge that narcissistic way of life or perception. Instead, what they do is they have these people, and these people will cater to the narcissist. Now, we don't want to confuse it and say, well, then it's those people's fault. But we don't want to do that because blame and shame gets us nowhere. So we don't want to do that. So we got to realize that this is also part of the other person. Could be the partner, the coworker, the sibling, whoever it is, that they're part of the system in which the narcissistic individual functions. And it can really seem super, super problematic and super, super destructive. And in many ways it is, because that empathy gets used and you get pulled in, because once they tap into your feelings and you need that sense of connection, right? That emotional, affective connection. So you need that. So without it, there's a bit of desperation that you want to connect. And here's this person, even though they're mean and terrible, they're using the right words and they're conveying a sense of what you're going through. And for some, that can mean a lot, because otherwise it's like an emotional desert. And they feel like that they're just in this dry environment. Sand is kicking all around, getting in their mouth and in their shoes and in their ears. And it's just everywhere. Dry, and nothing. And it's a really hard way to function. But it also puts those individuals at a high likelihood to be enlisted into these relationships. And that twisted empathy, that narcissistic empathy, gets continually used. And over time, what happens is that there's one of two things that's going to happen. Is the individual is going to start to push back and be like, hey, wait a minute. Why do I feel terrible about myself? I don't want to feel terrible about myself. Hold on there, Bill. What are you doing? Or the other one is that they capitulate. And when they capitulate, they're like, well, there's nothing else out there for me. So sometimes it's better to just learn to live with what I've got than it is risking to learn something different. And it's the old saying, right? The devil you know is better than the devil you don't. And I think that's an individual decision for everybody. That's a really tough one, and I completely understand that. And we have to have empathy for these folks, because it's a really hard life, because even though that erosion isn't always seen on the outside, at least not initially, and some folks can go decades, and it starts to show in anxiety and depression, substance abuse, alcoholism, other types of factors as well. So I think that we have to have a degree of empathy for those folks, just like we have empathy for children of narcissistic parents. So what do we do? How do we deal with twisted narcissistic empathy? Well, let me tell you. What we do is, first, you got to recognize that it's going on. You have to be honest about the person that you're interacting with, the person you're dealing with. Is this person hypersensitive? Whenever they get any feedback, do they immediately take it as criticism and then just freak out, right? Are they having these fits, these rages? What? How could you say? And you're like, huh? What? All I said is it looks like your tires, you're running out of air. Hey, man, don't tell me that I don't know about, air pressure in tires. It's like, okay, right? That they fly off the handle, like something like that. I mean, here's somebody just being nice. So, get your own example. And you see that they turn everything into a criticism. Hypersensitive about how they're perceived. Hypersensitive about the people that are with them, about how they're perceived. And everything has to impact or involve them. Otherwise, they have zero interest, no concern. Now, here's the thing. Are all adolescents narcissists? No. Adolescents are very egocentric. That's part of the developmental process. And we hope that through the development that they learn not to be so egocentric and and they're not really narcissistic, but not to be so self-focused. Now, narcissistic would imply that there is a negative, a maladaptive pattern of behavior. So when we talk about egocentric, this is just, it's all about you and how it impacts you, but you still might have some genuine empathy for your friends, or you hear a story about someone who had passed away or who's struggling, and it's genuine empathy. But what happens is as you get older, you build on that empathy, and empathy is a skill like ice skating or roller skating. The more you do it, the better you get at it, and you start to build more empathy and be more compassionate towards others. And that attenuates the narcissism, stops it from continuing to grow and being more problematic. So what we want to do is we want people to continue to grow and to have more empathy. If you're in these relationships, you've got to pay attention of who you're living with, who you're interacting with, who you're working with, because narcissists structure their world so it continually reinforces their narcissism. Don't be part of that. It is not a healthy thing, and I know it's really hard. Sometimes Sometimes it's your boss, and sometimes it's your partner, and sometimes it's your brother, sister, mom, dad, cousin, neighbor, whoever it might be. And it can be really complicated, and it is, because these people are hypersensitive to anything that doesn't make them feel or look great. And that is a problem, because many times they will just fly off the handle, and sometimes really surprising as to what's going on, because narcissistic rage is a thing. Narcissistic rage is that they've incurred what's called a narcissistic wound, right? They've hurt their feelings, and they feel as though their sense of greatness is being challenged. So then they massively react, and they overreact in a very destructive way towards the individual who hurt them. So we see that. So that's also where that big caution lies as well. So we got to be aware that narcissists often twist empathy in order to pull people in order to get a greater sense of emotional control, and you don't want to be a part of that. And if you're in it, you have to start looking at that relationship and what your options are and how you can survive it or make that relationship work if that's what you choose, or how you can get out of it so that you can have a better life, a life that is also emotionally fulfilling. Easy to say and hard to do, and I totally get it. I hope you found this helpful, and I'll see you next time. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.